Welcome everyone to our episode number 5 of the Defender for Endpoint Ninja Show. My name is Heike, I will be your host, and today it's all about next generation protection. And I have a SME with me, and I'm super proud that I could get him on the show, Paul. So Paul, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Heike. Welcome everyone. It's going to be meow-tastic on this Ninja Cat show, I'm sure. Thanks for having me. So my name is Paul. I won't bother you with my last name. I'm a program manager on the Defender for Endpoint crew, working on new stuff, particularly with a focus on data center technologies. Anything in the data center that needs protection is under my purview. And happy to talk about next generation protection, what it is.
Thank you so much. Before we dive into the show, a couple of reminders. You have a Q&A button up there, so please ask your questions. And we have other SMEs in the background that will answer your questions. And don't forget to go on our show page, aka.ms/ninja show, download some of the bonus content. We have a lot of nice backgrounds and videos that you can use in your own presentation. So, Paul, I heard some birds tweeting that you are working on a little side project.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Absolutely. So it's been creating quite a buzz on Twitter, and which is where you picked up on it. I'm writing a book. I'm actually teaming up with a bunch of enthusiasts within Microsoft, and it's just such a lot of fun. So the book is about, it's titled Microsoft Defender for Endpoint in depth. We're about, I would say, 40% in. So it's going to take us a little while to actually get it finished and get it published, but we're working with a publisher, and it's just been a lot of fun. And we're really going into some of the nitty-gritty. We have had interviews with some of the founders of specific products and features, and doing a little bit of history writing as well. It's amazing how far we're getting with sort of getting this deep level background and having these insights. And so the purpose of the book is really to help you understand the context around Defender for Endpoint. Often it's daunting when you talk about Defender for Endpoint, all of the capabilities, all of the documentation, all of the excellent ninja training. It takes you a while to get through. So this is really as a reference point, really help you grasp and consume other content and understand, hey, this is what it does, this is why I need it, and this is how I can actually get started on it. So hopefully a lot of people will benefit from it.
Yes, so we will definitely make a post and more buzz around it once it's actually published. Yeah. So now let's go into our topic, next generation protection. Paul, why is it called like that? And maybe also a little bit where are we coming from to get there? A little bit of background background details or information, please.
Absolutely. And then this is a large part of what we've been doing, getting into the book. We actually went back all the way to the 90s, to the origins of Defender, to sort of build up to where we are today. So I'll skip over the first 15 years or so in the interest of time. But that said, really, there's a couple of key challenges that we're trying to solve, which sort of made us rethink what is anti-malware protection, what is antivirus, because we've gone way beyond simple viruses back in the day. And so there's a lot of pivot points that cause us to evolve the product to such a point that right now it's a planet scale cloud service, which is behind it and which is helping us solve for all of these new challenges. So if we go to the slide deck, we'll first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about the threat landscape. So what are we solving for? There's not just one thing. I would say at the advent of what we call cloud delivered protection was polymorphism, huge volumes of new malware coming out hourly and us having to pivot to defend against that. But then we also saw this shift towards fileless threats. And then fileless threats, it's kind of a broad level category name for any threat that can use elements of either what's already on the box or completely run without putting some code on the box. This is actually the most prevalent category nowadays, and the most advanced threats actually sit in this area. So fileless threats, that's the key takeaway here. Definitely of concern. And then moving on, what's next? Like, as an evolution of fileless threats was, well, clever attackers using fileless threats to launch what we call human-operated ransomware campaigns. And this is the number one priority within Microsoft today, given the scope and the sheer destructiveness of these attacks, where a combination of highly advanced techniques, tools, and malware are involved to really go for an entire company. And we've all heard this in the news. And so what we're trying to do is really shift left as much as possible, right? Make sure that we can prevent any type of human-operated ransomware, nip it in the bud as quickly as we can. And if we can't, then at least have a very, very rapid and foremost automated response, right? And this is actually the whole pre-breach that we're trying to do as part of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, so you don't have to deal with it, right? That said, there's a lot of synergy across the portfolio that actually extends that initial strong protection all the way to rapid detection and response. And so it lines up neatly, and that is very intentional.
When you talk about this, there must be, of course, automated a lot on our end here as well. So tell us about it.
Yeah, so what's good to understand here is that we're, like I mentioned earlier, we're doing this at planet scale. And that sounds impressive, and honestly it is. More than 2 billion files are analyzed daily. It's probably more. Last time I pulled up that statistic was actually a couple of years ago. But the premise here is that how do you get through that huge amount of data? So this is where the data lake and machine learning approach comes in, and we've been working on this since early 2010s, where we take all of these signals from all of these endpoints and we analyze them using a variety of machine learning components. Now there's an interaction between what's on the client and what's in the cloud. And the intent is, when we see something completely new, we need to very quickly identify what it is. Now, the cheapest way of doing that is on the client. So that's obviously where we defend against the majority of malware. Client is very capable of handling itself. But if it doesn't know, there's two possible outcomes. One, I'm going to go ahead and block because I think it's something bad, but I'm not entirely sure. Or I'm going to allow it to run. That leads to obviously either false positives, like it wasn't bad, but I couldn't determine it, or false negatives. It's probably even worse. I didn't see that it was bad and I let it run. So that's where the client actually gets augmented by the cloud, where we can do very, very, very rapid lookups and come back with a result from a giant supercomputer up in the sky that is just literally saying, okay, nope, I know what that is, kill it. So first and foremost, if I have an unknown file as the client engine, I go, okay, what is this? What do I already know about it? And so it looks at its local definitions and it cross compares against a lot of different aspects of that file just to determine at face value, what is this? Often for a majority of malware, that's it. I either block it or I don't. If it's more complex, if it's polymorphic, if it's wrapped a certain way, if it's net new, that's when we start using a deterministic model. If we can find out based on attributes that we're about 80% confident that this is bad, we will probably need another 10% to really determine that it's bad. And that's where we start going to metadata-based ML models. So based on everything that we've observed about the file, we send off a request to cloud and say, hey, do you know what this is? And the cloud can actually answer and say, okay, yeah, Yep, I've seen this before. Go ahead and block it. I'll give you the extra confidence here. Boom, blocked. If not, that's when you start going down further down the funnel and we start pulling this malware apart and start analyzing it and come back with a verdict. Now, in Windows 10, we can actually hold the file and stop it from executing and then give the verdict and either block or allow it to run. And so this is what you might know as block at first sight. If we time out somehow, this malware is so advanced that we can't really identify it, eventually it's allowed to run, but we still keep processing all of that data. And if we come back with, oh yeah, we should have blocked it, we actually go back into the endpoint, go ahead and block it. But what else is going on in the meantime? That this intelligence that we're building spread across the world. So now every other device in the world is also protected against that malware. And so this is where that power of the cloud really comes into play.
Wow, Paul, that's a lot of technology in the cloud. But you mentioned also the endpoint, that there is a lot on the endpoint to actually stop threats right there. Do you want to explain what's on the endpoint?
So we take what we learn from cloud, all of the analysis, and obviously we bring it back down to the endpoint in various different ways through definition updates, through logic updates, but we also have a more dynamic mechanism. In case of an outbreak, we can simply say to the whole world, okay, pay attention here. This is very important, and we need you to start blocking this straight away instead of trying to analyze, hey, there's this new thing and you need to go through all of the steps to figure out what it is. No, instead of that, we're just saying, hey, this thing bad. And so there's a lot of intelligence that actually gets sent back to the client. And if you look at this graphic, you'll see a couple of keywords on the bottom there for client: heuristics, emulation, and client-side machine learning. Client-side machine learning is a very broad description of all of the intelligence that we preload on the device that's capable of making its own determinations. This is actually inclusive of a large piece of behavior monitoring as well, right? It's not just, hey, there's a family of malware that you can detect in a certain way. It's also based on behavioral patterns. And then the second piece there, heuristics, I mentioned this before. We start scoring something and say, okay, we probably know this is bad. Oh, now it's doing this. Okay, so now we're more confident, up to a point where we're saying like, okay, yeah, this is bad. And then emulation is a really cool technology. It actually sounds a lot like detonation, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But that's where we allow, quote unquote, to let the malware run. But in fact, we're pretending it's running. And so we're studying the behavior of what it would do if it were actually allowed to run. And that's very often it exposes what the malware would do next and gives us a chance to block it based on that behavior.
So basically, you will see if there is suspicious, malicious behaviors in that malware or fileless thing.
Correct.
What's running. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
very
go.
good point. I mean, this is one of the best ways to defeat the fileless nature because you're studying behavior instead of trying to analyze a file before it actually executes. It goes beyond that. You see from the left side to the right side, you'll see that we go into this behavior monitoring, memory scanning, energy integration, and network monitoring. That's when we obviously continuously look at what the system is doing. And so after emulation completes and we say, okay, let's go ahead and let this thing run, we still have this behavior monitoring that is looking at the entire sequence of events and going like, okay, so but what happened next and what happened next? And we keep scoring in that model until we make a determination. This actually sounds a lot like EDR. And the funny thing is, it is. It is a lot like EDR. And the reason for that is that it's post-breach or post-execution. And we do an analysis based on behavior. And so those are the common elements between AV and EDR. And this entire premise is actually at the foundation of what we have in detection and response today in the product. So our EDR solution actually started as an evolution in behavior monitoring based on AV.
That little circle in the middle, which is like cloud and client, it looks like it's in pre-execution, but I think it's really just because it's in the middle of the picture. So it has nothing to do. It's like across the whole pre and post. It's a combination, right? It's
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's just to signify the constant possible interaction between the two. I mean, the client side can do a lot by itself, but at the end of the day, for the really advanced attacks, you really want that cloud component and you want that EDR involved as well. And speaking of EDR, if you take a look at how next generation protection actually sits inside of Defender for Endpoint, you'll see that a lot of it is an interaction. We do the pre-execution blocking. We'll give you an alert. Great. We stop this malware. You're not infected. Good. But then when we start moving into behavioral space is when we can cross compare. Defender AV is looking at the execution behavior. Then EDR is looking at the overall behaviors on the system. So a download was performed, then something started running and we saw a script and we saw that and we saw malware, etc. So the entire sequence of events constructed together, and both of them determine and say, hey, yeah, this is bad now. So let's go ahead and analyze everything and see what we need to clean up. And so there's this concept called a rapid protection loop that essentially also helps in a larger scale of things where once we do determine that this was bad based on everything that we know, we can send that out into your entire organization.
you talked about, you have the AV and then you have the EDR. What is EDR block and when is it used?
Right. So one thing to know about EDR block is that it essentially it does some of what we just discussed, which is why it jumped you to, hey, what about EDR block? The reason for that is very logical. This mechanism is at the foundation of EDR block. However, when you're not running Defender Antivirus as your active AV, EDR block is there to sort of close the loop on that. So it's an augmentation of what we call passive mode. And let me just back up a bit. Various different modes within the product for Defender AV when you're using it with Defender for Endpoint. Only when you're using Defender for Endpoint, we have a concept called passive mode. Now that means that Defender Antivirus is just sitting there, sitting on the box, waiting to be called.
So it means, sorry, I think so it means a customer is using Defender for Endpoint, but they decided to have a third-party AV. They're using the other features in Defender for Endpoint, but not the AV.
Correct.
Now our AV is in passive mode if they did not disable it, which we don't recommend because then even that technology won't work. And basically now there is an EDR detection and we wake up our passive AV.
Pretty much, yeah. In a nutshell, that's a good way of putting it. You could say that we specifically want Defender AV to be available in a standby mode. You can call it passive mode, but that's actually a little bit too active in wording because it's not going to do anything unless it's called by EDR. And so that's also the premise behind EDR block, where we not just sit by and wait for some command to come. Like if you're doing an investigation, you say, oh, I want to block a file, I want to run an AV scan. Some of these response commands, those are actually what leverage the passive mode. EDR block goes a little bit further than that because it is making a determination based on behavioral analysis that this virus or malware, it should have been blocked. And for some reason, the primary antivirus, which is not Defender, didn't block it. And so EDR block is another layer of defense in saying, okay, based on everything I know now, this should have been blocked. And because EDR block is on, I'm going to go ahead and block it. So that's the difference between passive mode and EDR block.
That brings me actually to a question you just mentioned, block a file or do an AV scan. What are the features, functionalities that do not work if someone is not using the next generation protection from Defender for Endpoint?
Yeah, great question. Because in many cases, you really want those capabilities. They're very important capabilities. So, I mean, first and foremost, anything that Defender does in active mode, is out of the picture. So any real-time protection, the cloud protection pieces, attack surface reduction rules, also dependent on that real-time blocking capability. Network protection, same thing. You don't get
We
network
covered
protection.
those, by the way, in the previous episode. So if someone
Right.
missed it,
The
go
attack
back.
surface reduction capabilities. Yeah. And so you need Defender in active mode in order to even benefit from those. And there's a couple of other things that work sort of between the interplay of EDR and next generation protection, where if you want to do a block indicator, that requires real-time protection. If you want to do a block URL indicator, but not file, it requires network protection, which requires Defender Antivirus. So anything that has any blocking involved, like that's a simple way of putting it, anything that requires blocking needs Defender AV in active mode. And then there's a couple of audit things as well. If Defender is not allowed to scan something, you're not going to get any data. So there's a lot of audit events that you'd miss as well.
Thank you so much. Let's move to something automation. The automation that is built in into Defender for Endpoint Paul. Yes. Will this work if AV is in passive mode?
Yes. So let's dive a little bit into that. Or we can do a little bit of a demo.
Yes, please.
First, let's take a look at how does antivirus alerts or anti-malware alerts end up in our portal. One way of pulling up what's going on the AV side in your environment is by going to your alerts queue, filtering on antivirus, and you'll get hopefully not too many interesting examples like I do in my demo environment. But yeah, this is all the output you get from alerts. That doesn't mean that this is the only output you get from AV. It simply means that these are the ones that Defender for Endpoint decided to create an alert about. Now, was prevented typically shows up as either low or informational. And the reason for that is, well, not just because it was stopped, and then because it was stopped, it's less of a threat, but it's also based on what we think the severity is. So a Mimikatz credential theft tool is seen as a higher severity than something that is a bit more commodity, like hack script malware, which is actually a very generic way of indicating a family of stuff that's generally bad, but by itself it doesn't do much. So that's the context that I want to bring to the table when you start looking at these alerts. Please don't look at these alerts separately and go out and investigate them. Context is everything. The reason I'm pulling this up is just to illustrate my point.
And I think we started talking about automation, and if automation works, if the AV is not our AV as a primary AV, right. You're saying yes. So let's go and have a look. Yes. But absolutely. You know, again, it works, but of course we highly recommend, because of all the functionality that doesn't work if you turn off our AV and use a third party, we want everyone to use the MDE NextGen Protection, just to give this again a point here.
Absolutely. And there's, I mean, outside of that full set of functionality, like you mentioned, Heike, you also have to be very careful not to disable Defender. Because if you do, a couple of other things actually aren't going to work. And you can also see those in your interface here. So let me just go ahead and pull up. Before we move to the automation part, I'll get to that, Heike, I promise. I'm just building up to it. So if we go to, for example, a machine over here, and we go to the device page, on the device page, you'll see a couple of response capabilities, right? And these response capabilities that are AV related are run AV scan. Now, if Defender is disabled, you're not going to be able to do that, right? And there's a couple of other items here, like creating an indicator as a response. Like if you want to block a file, it's not going to work. So those are the top of mind things that you might want to make sure that first and foremost, Defender is not disabled. In fact, it should be in passive mode, because then it's running, it's still being updated. And so we avail of that engine sitting on the box, and the EDR can leverage that engine in a variety of ways, including automated investigation and response. So I pulled up an incident here, and you'll see in this incident, if you haven't seen this before, it's obviously an amazing experience where multiple sources are being put together. But let me just go ahead and zoom in on the investigations here, because these investigations, they ran by Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on a couple of machines. And then we found one reason to go out and investigate, which was suspicious access to the LSAT service. Now, this is something that actually could be blocked by ASR if you're in active mode, so that's a cool thing to know. But here, we'll see our automation engine, and you probably have seen this before. This very cool technology. Heike was at the forefront of when this company was acquired, called Hexadite, and they did a very, very interesting thing because they built their automation on top of Defender Antivirus. So in fact, Defender Antivirus is doing all of the legwork for this automation. The way it works is once we have something to investigate, a trigger, in this case, suspicious access to LSAT service, the automation engine goes ahead and sends a few commands to its client component telling it, go investigate. And then it gives us some context, like, okay, these are the events and these are the files that you need to investigate. But the rest is up to the engine. And you'll see here, it does a lot of analysis. Guess how it does that analysis? It leverages the anti-malware engine. And so you'll see a huge amount of work performed based on behaviors. So this is, I would say, another example of behavior-based, in this case, investigation. If you look at entities here, you'll see whole lot of files, processes, services, drivers, IP addresses, and persistent methods investigated. All of this is performed by Defender AV. Then you'll see in the log, and this is why it's interesting to dive into that log to learn more about how AV works. In the log, you'll see that it's grouping them together, and it's saying, hey, find files by name, and then it goes ahead and builds lists of files, like file information, classify files based on hashes. This is where it actually starts doing cloud lookups for those hashes. Like, have we seen this hash before? It's very rapid, very quick way of getting some information, right? And it does more than that. I'm just saying that this is a quick lookup. Now, at the end, it can even mass ask the cloud or mass send file metadata to get a verdict from the cloud with the sole purpose of being very, very thorough, not just looking at whatever malware there was and what files it produced, but anything that could have been touched by it. Anything in the context of this alert gets a big check over by the anti-malware engine. And then, and this is what I feel is the coolest part, once we identified, yes, other files got compromised, we need more cleanup, we want to remove all the remnants, we found fileless attacks and we want to remove some scripts and some remnants of that, EDR actually creates a definition for what it wants cleaned up and sends it to the anti-malware engine, which then proceeds to remediate. So that's sort of how this works behind the scenes. I thought it was a very cool demo to highlight how certain things interact.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. We will actually have a session coming up next about investigation. We go through the alerts and the incidents. And then the next session is about automation. And we will have a deeper look into all the things that the automation does as well. So thank you so much, Paul. Talking about the portal or like being in the portal, there is also something pretty new, which is file submission, unified file submission, where someone can submit a file to Microsoft. What is that about, Paul?
Yeah, so let me see if I can pull that up real quick. But when you encounter a file that was either not blocked and you thought it should be, aka you think it's malware and Defender didn't block it, or it's not malware and it was blocked, so a false positive, then you'll want to inform Microsoft that, well, Microsoft, you messed up. Can you please do better? And so we have had for years now a portal called the Microsoft Malware Protection Center, where you could submit a file for analysis and say, hey, this is my file. It's bad or it's good. Microsoft, can you please look at it? And then consequently, what Microsoft does is we use our research team to analyze the file and classify it and pull it apart and see where we missed it or where we blocked it maybe falsely. So that is where you need to download the file and go ahead and upload it again in a different portal. Unified submissions allow you to do that right from the portal without having to go to a separate page, without having to download and upload the file, and it also works for email. And this is why it's unified.
Nice, thank you. And then there is one other thing, not to be confused with our detonation. So once you're actually in the portal, click on a file, you get to the file page, and this is where you find those things, which is you can submit it for detonation, which will let the file run in a sandbox environment, and then you will get back a readable report to understand what that file is capable to do. What is it like trying to gain persistence, doing some network connections and all these things. So this is another option. So just that don't get confused with a unified file submission.
Yeah, great call. So, I mean, this is essentially detonation. Like when we talked about detonation before, when we talked about the different engines in cloud protection, that, in cloud protection, we can do automated detonation if need be of a sample, if it turns out that we just can't make a determination. But inside of Defender for Endpoint, if you, as an analyst, want to know more about the file without, again, having to download it and execute it yourself and analyze it, this is where deep analysis or file submission comes into play. You can, in fact, go to the portal, find a file of interest, and then say, hey, submit this file for deep analysis, and it will actually perform a very similar detonation as cloud protection for you and come back with a report. And that will help you be a little bit more informed about what it is in your environment.
So another very innovative feature is Tamper Protection, Paul, which is also connected here. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, yeah. So Tamper Protection is it's very cool technology, and it does a lot more, surprisingly, than you might think at face value. So Tamper Protection started a couple of years ago. I would say 2016, 17, where we wanted to make it harder to change certain settings or to disable specific components of Defender Antivirus.
So Tamper with the engine, right?
Tamper, yeah, but I mean the premise here is that we already did a large amount of anti-tampering. So any type of protection to stop manipulation, to stop you from literally tampering with the engine, that was already in place. But the piece that wasn't necessarily in place was preventing even local administrators from turning things off. So, and you could call that tampering, which if you're being malicious, it is. But it's also like I'm an admin and I'm working on my box and, Defender is giving me some performance overhead. Let me go ahead and turn off real-time protection because, it bothers me. And so that's where Tamper Protection really comes in, is that you can, as an organization, prevent that from happening. So not to impact your security posture in your machines through legitimate interfaces as well. So the non-legitimate interfaces are well protected. Don't get me wrong. It's actually very hard to tamper with the engine, with the platform, you name it. But when it comes to admin configurable controls, that's where it gets a little bit more difficult, because at the end of the day, we also need to uphold the promise that you can configure the product, right? And that you can turn things on and off for your environment as appropriate. So that's where Tamper Protection really comes in. It finds sort of middle ground between allowing configuration, but yet denying it to specific admins. So,
and you have to turn Tamper Protection on. Is it on by default, or I don't know?
So if you, typically we have a couple of ways to enable or disable Tamper Protection. One way is through the master toggle in the portal. And I can
This is in
actually show you
advanced
that in the
settings,
portal.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's in your settings, in advanced settings. And what that does, it actually goes ahead and enables it for the entire organization. So here's the master toggle. If you have the right permissions, then you can turn this on or off for your entire environment. Now, it's not a very granular process. If you want to have more granular control, you can also configure Tamper Protection through Microsoft Endpoint Manager.
Okay.
So that's the other way of configuring this. You can even do an override. Say it's on by default for the entire organization, but send a policy through Intune saying, no, it's off for certain devices. So that's one way of turning off Tamper Protection if you do want to make changes. Another way is what's called troubleshooting mode. It's a fairly new feature. Yep. And so troubleshooting mode is intended to temporarily overcome that lockdown nature. So when you have applied a policy via whatever channel, even if Tamper Protection is not on, that policy sort of already locks down certain settings. Like you can't just go into the UI and say, okay, I want to turn off real-time protection. If it's being configured by policy, that button is grayed out. If Tamper Protection is then on top of that is enabled, you can't even use PowerShell or a different mechanism to turn off real-time protection. So that's where troubleshooting mode, you get a button on the machine page and you say, I want to enter troubleshooting mode. And from that point, you have a session during which you can, in fact, manipulate any setting on the device to figure out what it is that's going on. You can maybe run the performance analyzer tool for a little bit to see what's happening, identify if there's some sort of conflicting problem, or maybe a program that is causing performance impact and you want to create an exclusion for it.
Mm. And I remember when I read the blog, or when actually we had our webcast about it, internal. It's a great feature with a lot of security as well. So if you use the troubleshooting mode, which means you disable these kind of protection, it's a limited time window, and then it will turn on again automatically. And I think we will put a link in our chat window where people can read the details. So we don't want to go further right now. So Paul, this is great. When we think about AV, our AV is not just for Windows devices. So we also have AV protection for Linux, for Mac, for iOS and Android. And I think it's based on the need of those devices. Like it's not the same on an iOS device as it is on an Android device. Like, do you want to discuss this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, iOS and mobile devices are a lot different in nature than, for example, Linux, Mac, or Windows. So when we talk about these mobile devices, the key components there are we need to protect against malicious applications, right? And we need to protect against malicious links.
Yeah.
Given that a mobile device is always connected, then the majority of threats actually come from opening a link. And so those are the main attack vectors on a mobile device. There are some other ones, but generally those devices are pretty heavily locked down from an ecosystem perspective. So the focal point shifts there. And so we don't necessarily do anti-malware in a traditional sense where there we look at apps as the code that can run, and we have ways of detecting anomalies using cloud protection on mobile devices. So it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Mac and Linux, things start looking a lot more like Windows, especially Linux, a very open ecosystem. Essentially, you can install whatever you want, and it can be a large permutation of software there. And then Mac OS is a little bit more restricted, but a lot of similarity with Linux. And so what we recently did there, we actually released a new engine. And this new engine is more like the Windows one, where we have all of these components that we mentioned earlier, the client side, the cloud side, the capabilities of blocking. We gained indicators, file indicators functionality. And so there's a common ground there where this engine, this new engine, is so similar to the Windows one, we can actually cross-develop for it. So a very cool fact here is that with that new engine, you can in fact block Windows malware on Linux and Linux malware on Windows, because there is a shared set of intelligence that is common across platforms. So that's very interesting.
Okay, see, I didn't know. I learned a lot today, by the way, Paul. So thank you so much. I think we covered a lot, Paul. So we talked about a little bit the threat landscape, how it evolved over time. We talked about the power and the need of having a cloud protection, about all the technology that is on the endpoint, as well as what's the visibility in the portal, what is the connection between, or like how are the technologies pre-breach and post-breach, AV and EDR working together with that continuous loop, or like, how did you call it? Fast loop?
Yeah. Yeah, behavioral blocking and rapid protection.
Rapid
Yeah.
protection. That was the one that I was looking for. So we talked about that. We talked about how automation is using and leveraging the AV on the endpoint. What's there if someone decides not to use it, which you don't want to do, so you want to use it. And yeah, now in the end, basically covered where do we have it for, what are the platforms. I think there was a lot for one show. I know we could go on and on because I have the expert here with me on the call. But as we heard at the very beginning, there's a book coming, and I'm pretty sure,
Yep.
Paul, you wrote a lot in that book. Also something that was not covered in the show just because of our short, or like a shorter time window that we have here. Again, Paul, thank you so much for being my expert on this show. I'm super excited about your book, so I'm waiting. You were saying 40%. I will check in on a weekly basis how this is progressing now. And yeah, again, thank you, Paul, for being my guest today.
Thank you, Heike.
And thanks everyone for watching. Don't forget to submit your feedback or your questions using Share Your Voice, which is aka.ms/ninja show. There's a button. Also, don't forget to sign up for the other sessions. Don't forget to download the bonus content and join us in the next session. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.